Welcome to the May 10th, 2020 Sunday service of New Creation Fellowship Church of Newton, Kansas. We gather together, though apart, to pray, worship, and learn. Join us in our call to worship. You may read the plain or the bold text as you prefer.
In you, O Lord, have I taken refuge. Let me never be put to shame.
Deliver me in your righteousness.
Incline your ear to me.
Make haste to deliver me.
Be my strong rock, a castle to keep me safe. For you are my crag and my stronghold.
For the sake of your name, lead me and guide me.
Take me out of the net that they have secretly cast for me.
For you are the tower of my strength.
Into your hands I commend my spirit.
For you have redeemed me, O Lord, O God of truth.
My times are in your hand.
Rescue me from the hand of my enemies, and from those who persecute me.
Make your face to shine upon your servant, and in your loving kindness save me. Hi friends, it's Rebecca from New Creation Fellowship Church. Today you've already heard a reading from Psalm 31. Psalms are a book of the Bible that have a lot of poems and maybe even songs in them. I want to talk about one of my favorite Bible verses, which is Psalm 31:3. Here's one way it's translated. Want God to be my strong rock, a castle to keep me safe, for you are my crag and my stronghold. You probably know what a rock is. Probably know what a castle is, but maybe not a crag and a stronghold. But how can God be like a rock or a castle or a crag or a stronghold? I think the writer of this verse meant that God was like a mountain, a huge rock. We can go into the mountains to run away from danger and hide. Have you ever heard someone say in a movie, "Run for the hills"? They mean run into the mountains because it's easier to hide there from danger than it is on the plains, because the mountains are full of twists and turns and little hiding spots. This picture is from one of my favorite mountains, the Grand Tetons in Wyoming, and I took this picture, I think in fall of 2018. It's really, really pretty. This is right on the Wyoming and Montana border. And these mountains are really sharp at the top. I think they're really pretty. Another way Psalm 31 talks about God is as a castle. Even if you haven't seen a castle in real life, maybe you've seen one in a movie. Castles are also places that are protected. Even if the wind blows you really hard or if it hails, you're safe when you're inside a castle. I think this verse means that God keeps us safe, just like living in a castle would keep us safe. This castle is Neuschwanstein Castle. It means Swan Castle in Germany. I haven't been here, but I bet somebody at our church has been. And when you go into this castle, there's a lot of different emblems and banners that have pictures of swans on it, since it's named Swan Castle. If you've been to Disney World and seen Cinderella's castle there, this is the castle it's modeled on. Or if you've ever seen a Disney movie come on, there's a Cinderella's castle is on the Disney logo. That's named after this castle too. But I think some of the newer Disney movies have the castle from Frozen instead. Psalm 31 also talks about how God is like a crag. This might not be a word that you know at all. A crag is a steep or rugged cliff. It's very hard to climb up a crag. So if you're on top of a crag, you're safe from dangers down below because they can't get to you. These pictures are from my friend Brad. And he took them at the Little Jerusalem Badlands State Park. And I know some people in our church have been there, so you can ask friends at church next time you get to see them if they've ever been there. This is not in our part of Kansas. This is kind of more north and towards Nebraska. But you can see all the really cool rock formations that are there. The last way Psalm 31 talks about God is as a stronghold. A stronghold is a place where people have built, so it's very hard for anyone else to get into. They're fortified. That means there's lots of measures, lots of things that they build to protect them from other people coming into them. This photo, I didn't take this photo, but I have been to this place. This is Meteora, Greece. And it's in Thessaloniki, Greece, in the northern part of Greece. And you can see here, there are huge, huge rocks. And sometimes people do free climb them. That means they climb them like without ropes or anchors. And sometimes you'll see even little goats up here. And at the top of these huge rocks are a series of monasteries. So here's one, but look way in the background, here's one too. And monks and nuns live there. And they spend their days worshiping God, learning about God, thinking about God. These are Greek Orthodox monks and nuns. So they're not a part of the Mennonite tradition, but they're a different kind of Christianity. And now there are roads to get up there. But when they were built, it's still difficult to get up there. It's still quite difficult. It's a long path, and even eventually the road stops and you have to walk a long way up a lot of steps to get there. But they have baskets that hang over the edge of these, out these windows, and they would have really, 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 really off the page long ropes that would go down, and they would bring things up and down in the basket to get goods up and down. The few things that maybe the monastery couldn't need, like if they needed medicine or something like that. But otherwise, they have like their own gardens and goats for milk and things like that. They're to be self-sufficient. So those would be very hard to get to. They're built that way so that they couldn't be attacked, and so that people, the monks and the nuns, when they were there, would be left alone because they needed the quiet time to go into worship. They didn't want to be interrupted. So they built these strongholds in places that were hard to reach so they could have, on purpose, kind of be isolated. I love this Bible verse because I can see in nature every day things that remind me of God. I can't see a castle every day. I can't see maybe a stronghold or a crag every day either. But every day I get to see rocks. And when I see them, I'm reminded that God is strong like a rock. And that when I stand where God is, I feel safe. That God keeps me safe and protected. And that these are things that don't move. God isn't blown around, right? That these are things that the weather can't change. They're very stable things. And that God is very stable and enduring, long-lasting. And those are qualities that make me feel safe when I think about God. Well, if you have something in your life that reminds you of some quality of God, like God's enduring nature or God's steadfastness, that means it stays steady. That's a confusing word because fast makes it sound like God is moving, but steadfast actually means stays steady. Here, fast means like fastened, is like locked down. If you have something in your life, maybe an object or something from your yard or something from your house that reminds you of God, I would love to hear about it. So if you have a grown-up in your house, you can ask them to take a picture of it and they could share it on our church Facebook page, or you can text it to me, or you could put it in a letter and send it to the church, and I would love to hear about it. I hope you liked looking at these pictures today. Today's lectionary reading comes from the book of Acts, chapters 6 through 7.
Stephen, full of grace and power, did great wonders and signs among the people. Then some of those who belonged to the synagogue of the freedmen, as it was called, stood up and argued with Stephen, but they could not withstand the wisdom and spirit with which he spoke. Then they secretly instigated some men to say, "We have heard him speak blasphemous words against Moses and God." They stirred up the people as well as the elders and scribes. Then they suddenly confronted him, seized him, and brought him before the council. They set up false witnesses who had said, "This man never stops saying things against the holy place and the law, for we have heard him say such things, say this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy the place and will change the customs that Moses handed on to us." And all who sat in the council looked intently at him and saw that in his face was like the face of an angel.
Then the high priest asked him, "Are these things so?" And Stephen replied, "Brothers and fathers, listen to me." He then told them the history of the Jews from God's promise to Abraham to the exodus from Egypt and deliverance into Palestine. Over and over again, he stresses, God saves the people, but they are faithless. They keep turning to the other useless deities. Even when they remember God, they try to shrink the Lord of heaven and earth down into something they can comprehend and control.
Stephen tells them, "Yet the Most High does not dwell in the houses made with human hands, as the prophet Isaiah says, 'Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What kind of house would you build for me, says the Lord? Or what is the place to rest my legs? Did not my hand make all these things? You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you are forever opposing the Holy Spirit, just as your ancestors used to do. Which of the prophets do your ancestors not persecute? They killed those who were foretold the coming of the righteous one, and now you have become his betrayers and murderers. You are the ones that received the law as ordained by angels, and yet you have not kept it.
When they heard these things, they became enraged and ground their teeth at Stephen. But filled with the Holy Spirit, he gazed into heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing there at the right hand of God. "Look," he said, "I see the heavens open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." But they covered their ears, and with a loud shout all rushed together against him. Then they dragged him out of the city and began to stone him. And the witnesses laid their coats at the feet of a young man named Saul. While they were stoning Stephen, he prayed, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." Then he knelt down, cried out in a loud voice, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." And when he had said this, he died.
We prepare our hearts, minds, and spirit to receive these words by joining in a prayer together. During this prayer, there'll be an opportunity to pause and offer your own petitions to God.
Mighty and loving God, we thank you that through your great love we have enough love to share and are assured that your goodness to us never fails, no matter the circumstance. We pray for our friends and neighbors, known and unknown, that we may all have peace of heart, rest and renewal, hope and rejoice, patience and forbearance. And we pray especially for the burdens that concern us today, including we give you thanks that we are members of the global church, like all people, called by love to love, siblings in a family called humanity. By your grace, assist us in our pilgrimage, that we hear the stories of our faiths with minds open, curious, and thoughtful, and hearts tender and ready. Amen.
Today's lectionary text is the story of Stephen, the proto-martyr, the first person we know to be killed for following Jesus. It's a story found only in Acts, but it gives us a powerful template for what we come to expect in a martyr story. There's a tense interaction between a single righteous individual and powerful authorities. There's a dramatic speech, a violent death, and then off in the corner, lurking, a bad guy who's observing the whole thing, who we know is going to become the dynamic character, the one who has a changed part. Here, that's Saul, who's going to soon be called Paul. We see him nodding with approval at the murder of Stephen. He's not lifting a hand himself to throw a rock, but encouraging a brainless crowd to do the dirty work of murdering our first martyr. The passage is quite long, which is why we don't read all of it word for word, and it tells a story that people familiar with the Hebrew scriptures would have known. And in fact, that's why Stephen tells it. He's being brought before the Sanhedrin, which is a group of 71 rabbis that meet in Jerusalem to try trials. In front of the most important body of Jewish scholars, he launches into a lengthy history of God's promises to Israel, promises that illustrate God's greatness and God's goodness to the Jewish people. And he goes on and on for 53 verses. It would be like if you appeared before the Supreme Court and instead of arguing your case, you decided to give them a lecture on the history of constitutional law. It doesn't seem necessary, and in fact, it seems a little bit cocky. What could Stephen possibly be telling them that they don't already know? And then he delivers the words that most enrage them. He tells them, "The Most High does not dwell in houses made with human hands." This seems like the thing that his accusers could agree with, because he's quoting Isaiah. He doesn't say it, but they know it, right? These are the leading intellectuals of Judaism. They recognize that quotation right away. And Isaiah was a prophet of their faith. So surely this group of religious teachers knew exactly the passage, and they would have understood why he was telling them to. This is why they're angry. Where did Stephen deliver his words? In the temple. Literally, the Sanhedrin met there to hear cases of blasphemy, the crime he's accused of. So Stephen shows up to the temple, the place that Jews had built first under Solomon and then rebuilt under Ezra and Nehemiah, to worship God. And he says to them, this temple where we're standing right now is nothing. God is not here. The thing that you built thinking that it was where God lives, God scoffs at your misunderstanding of God's greatness. That's the blasphemy. Shrinking God down to think that you can fit God into a building. To understand why Stephen's word hurt so much, we have to remember that the building of the temple was central to reestablishing Jewish identity in Jerusalem after the city had been captured by the Neo-Babylonians generations earlier. The captured Jews were exiled 1,600 miles away, but were eventually, generations later, able to return, at least some of them. When they did, they rebuilt the city walls to keep out invaders and rebuilt the temple. And they didn't let other Yahweh worshippers, like the Samaritans, in. Their ancestors had taken a great risk, leaving cosmopolitan Babylon, where they had relative religious freedom, to return to a land they had only known about from their parents' and grandparents' stories. When they arrived, they worked with tools in one hand and swords in the other to be ready to fend off attackers. In an effort to define themselves as a people, they defined themselves against Samaritans, who they also shared ancestors with. And part of defining themselves against the Samaritans was their insistence that sacrifices could only be made in the temple. The Samaritans, in contrast, had argued that they could be made other places as well, that God was indeed not tied to a specific place. By the time of Jesus, the tension between the two groups was so ingrained that Jesus could tell the story, the parable of the Good Samaritan, knowing that his audience would understand that the Jew and the Samaritan were inherently assumed to be enemies. Indeed, the Sanhedrin, who met in the temple, were comprised of three classes of Jews. First, priests. Second, Levites, who were members of the tribe that supplied assistance to the priests. So to be a priestly assistant, you had to be part of that tribe. And third, men whose families were considered to have the purity of blood necessary to allow their daughters to marry priests. The temple and the Sanhedrin both represented purity of identity. So the temple meant a lot to these Jews. It gave them an identity and a history. It helped them define themselves as a people against other Yahweh worshippers. And it was an area of their lives where they, as Jews, had control when so much of the rest of their lives was being controlled by the Roman regime. In another generation, the temple would be destroyed again, this time by Roman forces who were trying to quell Jewish dissent. So the Jewish leaders themselves likely knew that too much rabble-rousing among the Jews, among people like Stephen, well, that would endanger the temple and Jewish life in Jerusalem. Stephen wasn't just hurting their feelings, he was actually risking their lives. He was also quoting their own scriptures back to them. And boy, that had to hurt. To have your own words flung back at you. To know in some way that they were right. But to know that recognizing that would mean a major revision of your belief and your entire possible life. If God wasn't in the temple, then the Samaritans wouldn't be wrong to worship God outside of it. If God wasn't in the temple, then God must be bigger than the Jews had recognized. If God was bigger than they recognized, then they had to admit that they had wanted a small God for some reason. And that might mean admitting that they were afraid of the demands that a more expansive God might place on them. But Stephen, despite his boldness and his scolding, also loves these men. He sees himself as one of them. After all, he addresses them with affection and a recognition of their common Jewishness, and with humility. Listen to me, fathers and brothers. He is one of them. He shares their history as he demonstrates when he retells it. Some biblical scholars argue that Stephen's anti-Jewish as he's anti-temple, but he seems to be saying, I think, I am one of you, which is why I am reminding you of what our prophet Isaiah said. You cannot box God in. The one who created the whole world is bigger and is too big for your temple and too big for your nationalistic visions. And that's terrifying to hear if what you need is a God you can box in so you can box your enemies out. And it's terrifying if what you need is a God you can control so that your fellow believers don't agitate the murderous Roman regime too much. Then Stephen drives the point home. He says to them that they are uncircumcised in heart and spirit. To be the premier Jews by training and tribe and family lineage, and to be told that you are uncircumcised, the very mark to distinguish between Jewish men and non-Jewish men. Now, as Mennonites, we have no insult that is equal in comparison. You can tell me that I can't sing four-part harmony well. You can tell me that my bieroks are soggy and my whoopie pies are flat. You can leave me out of the Mennonite game entirely and let me know I have the wrong last name to play it. But you can't hurt me like that accusation would have hurt Stephen's listeners. He is saying basically, you look the part, right? You are circumcised, but you are not circumcised in spirit. You look the part, but you aren't the real thing. All those signals you send out to let others know that you're pure, authentic, and the only ones loved by God, they're lies. And it's not just you. Your ancestors, the one who built this worthless temple, and the ones who rebuilt this worthless temple, they were the same way. Don't quote Isaiah at me if you know that you would have been the ones he was yelling at. You have all the advantages of a people loved by God, and you waste every one. What do? They cover their ears and they shout over him. Why? Why do we cover our ears and shout when we hear something hard? Have you ever done that in an argument? Maybe when you were a child. You stick your fingers in your ears and you sing, la, 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 I can't hear you, as loudly as you could, to drown out the noise of a parent or a sibling or a friend telling you something you do not want to hear. I want to tell you a different story about some visitors who were in town recently. A few weeks ago, members of Westboro Baptist Church in Topeka came here to our town to picket. They were drawn by our city's consideration of an ordinance that would protect LGBTQ+ people from discrimination. They picketed near City Hall, and as many of you know, I spent many years studying this group for my graduate work and research that led to a book. So of course, I wanted to go see them in person. We were on the cusp of a stay-at-home order at that point, so the streets were pretty quiet. Police presence was very significant for how few protesters there were, and a few people yelled as they drove past, and but there weren't many people on the sidewalk. There was one point when some young men pulled up pretty fast in a car and jumped out to engage church members, and police discouraged them from doing so. I brought my 15-year-old with me to observe, my oldest child, and for me, this was not a big deal. I had been to many pickets, almost all of them more tense than this one was. But when we got back to the car, my son was shaking a little bit. For him, this was an intense experience. And it was tense for others who walked or drove past too. For me, it wasn't a big deal. And that's not merely because of my temperament, which tends to be pretty low-key in stressful situations. And it wasn't because I'm pretty experienced in this exact situation, right? I'm an ethnographer of hate groups, so I see a lot of this. It's actually, I think, mostly theological. I'm not upset if people shout at me that I'm going to hell. I'm not upset if people claim that coronavirus is a punishment from God. I'm not angered that people believe that if we love our queer community members, our city will be doomed. Why not? It's because I don't believe those things are true. I'm not upset. I'm as upset about someone telling me to go to hell as I am about them telling me to go to Mars. In fact, me going to Mars is more likely, as unlikely as that is, especially since I hate flying. I don't believe in hell. I do believe in Mars. This doesn't, it's not upsetting to me to be told something that isn't true. How could it hurt my feelings to hear people say things that aren't true, even if they say them loudly and rudely? When people see that things that aren't true, they only make me think poorly of them. They don't make me think poorly of myself. But it does hurt. It's when people say things that are true about me. You can tell me I'm going to hell, and since I don't believe that, it doesn't hurt. But you mentioned that I'm too often impatient with people, and it stings. Ask me if I'm harboring some anger at someone I need to forgive, and I'm likely to be defensive. Suggest that maybe I should call my grandparents more often, and I'd be irked because you're right. Those are things I want to plug my ears against. I can handle someone screaming, "God hates you," in my ear, because that's nonsense. Rebecca, you need to be gentler with your words. Then I want to cover my ears and say, la, 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 la. And I think that's what Stephen's fathers and brothers here, men he loved and cared about, I think that's what they were doing. If Stephen was spouting nonsense, then they would have let it go. But because he was saying something that stung, and something that if others repeated it, could have really endangered the community, they covered their ears, shouted, then clenched their teeth, and picked up their stones. The consequences of Christian history are large. We have our first martyr and a scene that tells us just how bad Saul is prior to his conversion. But the Sanhedrin's presence is another part of the story. From here, Jewish and Christian history continues to separate. We get Stephen as a figure who's on the cusp of both a foreign-born, Greek-speaking Jew who knows his Jewish history pretty well. As such, he's a threat to notions of Jewishness that centered identity on Jerusalem, where he doesn't live, the Hebrew language, which is not his primary language, and exclusivity, which he argues against. It's just too much for the Sanhedrin to brook. I'm not throwing stones at the Sanhedrin here. I'm saying that perhaps we can identify. When do we cling to a small vision of God because it suits us? When do we try to make God's love less radical than it is? When do we try to shrink God's hospitality down so that we only welcome those people we prefer? When do we choose to preserve the past at the expense of a wider embrace? When do we comfortably quote the words of the prophets, but then refuse to live as they encouraged us? When do we experience the call to authenticity as threatening? How do we scramble to make Jesus' words mean anything other than what he meant them to mean? To love our God and to love our enemies, which are our neighbors, which includes our enemies, as we love ourselves. When do we cover our ears and shout to drown out those two commandments? As Christians, we often think about the tragedy of the story, and that it's Stephen's death. And of course, his death is tragic. We have in Stephen one of the few voices of a pre-Pauline faith. All the stuff that Paul gives us, which is most of the rest of the New Testament, Stephen didn't have. I would have really liked to have heard more from him. He's the only person outside of Jesus to call Jesus the Son of Man, and I wonder what that was about. He has this vision of Jesus at the right hand of God, and I wonder what that was about too. We know that later, after his conversion, Paul will go to the temple and participate in rituals there. That's told to us in Acts as well. Would Stephen have tempered his own views on the temple in order to accommodate Paul? Would Paul have persuaded him to lighten up, to let the people worship in the temple if they needed to? Would the two of them have been forever at odds on the issue? We don't know because Stephen's killed. But there is another tragedy here too, and that's for the Sanhedrin, the judges who become executioners. We know that Saul will have a change of heart. but we don't know what happened to the rest of them. Did they hear anything through their covered hands? Did they know anything he said? Did anything that he said sink into their hearts? Did they remember that he started by calling them fathers and brothers? When they went home that night, did they share what they had done with their family members? Did they wake up worrying about it? Did they ever seek the forgiveness that Stephen offered? Did they ever choose a bigger vision of God, no matter how frightening that was? We don't know the answers for them, but we get to choose the answers for us. Let this be our benediction today. May we release our small notions of God, which feel safe but never keep us safe. May we be enveloped by mercy, grace, and love wider than we can imagine. May we never be deceived into thinking we have seen the end of it or even the edge of it. May we live in God's loving kindness forever and ever, and welcome with open arms everyone who likewise finds comfort there. Amen.